peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next. And that would allow the new president to start building the institutions of democracy. So I'm not saying that it's plagued with ethnic problems, with drugs problems, with many problems. Democracy is not going to come overnight. But if we can effect a transfer of power, remember, Pakistan only had its first transfer of power from one civilian government to the next 9 months ago, and we've been going since 1947. So because we've had so many military rulers. So we have only. We are not any paragon of virtue, because we are also been very much behind in building democracy, because we've had martial law for so long. So I think a minimal demand is sorry, what is the second? Democracy in Pakistan. Yeah, Pakistani talks to the Taliban. Look, I think there is a very big difference between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. The first thing is that the Afghan Taliban are a much more cohesive political force. They have a central council. They have a leader who they still consider as their leader, Mullah Muhammad Umar. The whole council lives in Pakistan. The leader lives in Pakistan. And if the leader, they're probably divided on tactical issues. Who do we kill now? Who do we don't kill now? Whatever. But on strategic issues of war and peace, I think they will listen to their leader. And we know that the leadership took the decision to open a dialogue with the Americans, which was opposed by some of the younger hardliners, but the leadership did do that. And everybody had to accept that dialogue. Even though during the dialogue there was still a lot of fighting going on, but despite that. Now the Pakistani Taliban are a completely different kettle of fish. The Pakistani Taliban are essentially groups of tribesmen who are divided by their tribal loyalties, who became radicalized because of the long-term presence of the Afghan Taliban, but in particular because of Al-Qaeda, who were living amongst them for all the period before 9/11 and after 9/11. And as a consequence, what we have is, we do not have a coherent Taliban movement. Now, the group with which the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is talking right now considers itself as the main Taliban. But there are many groups outside this who don't consider them part of this alliance. And we are seeing this every day, because every day, even though the talks are on, and officially there is a ceasefire from the main Taliban, killing is still going on. Polio workers are being killed, doctors are being killed, and soldiers are being killed, policemen are being killed. So there are obviously groups within the Taliban there who are attempting to sabotage these talks. Now, personally, I believe that I think Nawaz Sharif has entered these talks far too prematurely. What was needed was a much more greater show of strength by the state. I think the army should have gone in once and shown its strength to these militants and forced them to the table, rather than the militants forcing the government to the table. And the government is now seen on the defensive. The Taliban are seen on the sort of political offensive and politically in control. And I think this is a very dangerous precedent to set, because the state is constantly having to backtrack and constantly having to talk from a position of weakness. I don't think this should be the case. Is that it? Who are the Taliban? Look, I mean, read my book. But this is a very long question. But look, I do not believe the US created the Taliban. Certainly the US can be blamed for creating the very terrible civil war that happened in Afghanistan, because it abandoned Afghanistan without looking for a peace settlement. And perhaps in history people will say that in 2014 the US did the same thing. It abandoned Afghanistan without seeking a peace settlement, and leaving Afghanistan. So the US did not support Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or any of these other groups. But so it abandoned Afghanistan to the civil war without interfering. And secondly, it gave Afghanistan over to the control of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to a very large extent. It said, whatever you guys want to do there, you do. Don't interfere us, and just sort of keep it low, keep it level. And of course, Pakistan promptly then. Again, I don't think we started the Taliban. We didn't. The Taliban were a creation of the civil war. They were a creation of the fed-upness of the Afghan population because of the civil war, the brutalities that the warlords were carrying on. But certainly, very quickly, Pakistan became the mainstay of the Taliban. It supported the Taliban army. It paid for the budget. It paid for the army, for the salaries of the troops, etc., etc. So I would still say that even today, even though the Taliban is seeking shelter in Pakistan for the last 14 years, the Taliban remain a very independent-minded group. They remain Afghans, remember that. They are not stooges of Pakistan. They remain Afghans. And I think one reason why they had started this dialogue with the Americans 2 years ago is that they wanted to go home. And they wanted to explore what could happen about a future settlement. I hope and I believe that there could be a much greater chance of peace if there's a new president who is accepted by the majority of the people.
Thank you. Next round, Rashid, then Kunduz, and then.
So first of all, in Kyrgyzstan, there is a process of syncretism between Islam and local culture. What about you are talking to work on a mentality to save the Islam and their local culture, which is symbiosis of the local Islam. So due to this issue, there is a nationalistic movement of the Tengris. They want to preserve the Islamic Kyrgyz culture. So due to this issue, they want to get registration of their movement as a religion in order to be able to compete with this nationalism, syncretization in the Kyrgyzstan. So what do you think? Is it right if they will get the registration, if they will get the acknowledgement as a religion, and to work for the societal security in Kyrgyzstan?
You really want to mess me up, don't you? You want the Kyrgyz police to come here and take me off?
Well, basically, yeah. Let's take a few more questions. Yes.
Thank you.
So, my question is very simple.
First Asil and then you.
Yes, I used to ask this question to all people who are actually kind of has an expertise in Afghanistan and this Taliban issue is that, now for 12 years, as you have said, not only U.S. but coalition forces tried to fight Taliban, and thinking from very simple logic is that. Here we have coalition with their technical, material, financial capacity, and then we have this Taliban who are known just militarily trained and very brutal men. Yes, and what is how should we understand that this coalition force for 12 years failed? I will assess as a failure that failed to fight Taliban. What is the main, very real reasons behind this? Because people say that there are a lot of Taliban and they're not located in one place and so on. Or their ideological very strong and then they cannot fight their ideology. But in your opinion, as a person who has studied Taliban and who introduced the term Taliban to the United States and to the West, what stands behind this failure? And
Okay.
although they don't accept it.
Thank you, and Kunduz, please, out loud.
Thank you so much. So I have a very simple question. You said that the Taliban have kept alive for a purpose, and then you also say that given that April 6th elections are held according to international standards and blah, 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 then the Taliban could be ready for peace. So I'm wondering, could you please clarify those two notions? I'm wondering, was the whole purpose of the Taliban to drive out foreign invaders and then hold elections and there would be peace, eternal in Afghanistan? Or what is I think these two notions kind of contradict each other, or just say something on that, please, more.
So what is they were pushing out with the ISF?
for nothing.
And talk to elected president, yes, please.
Look, the first question, I don't want to get too involved in Islam in Kyrgyzstan, of which I know nothing compared to any of you people. But first of all, I do believe that there can be a Kyrgyz identity for Islam or an Islamic identity for Kyrgyz, which is separate from the way, for example, Pakistanis interpret Islam, or Afghans or Indians or anyone else. But I do believe that the widest, no single group has a monopoly on creating such an identity. This has to be created by society as a whole. Now, technically, you can set up a commission, you can discuss this within the commission with all the stakeholders, which should include educationalists and women and all sorts of other people, civil society, the state. But essentially, this is going to take a period of time to develop. And in that period of time, the measures that you should certainly take are that outsiders should not be allowed to come in and create sectarianism within your societies. That's all I'm saying. So I think the government, the state, civil society should be here the determining factor of what constitutes Kyrgyz identity or Islamic identity for Kyrgyzstan. Now on the look, I mean, you're asking the classic question of fighting a guerrilla war. First of all, these are people who have been fighting since 1978. They consider that they defeated the Soviet Union, which was one of the world's superpowers. Okay, so remember, the Taliban are the children of the Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviets in the 80s. So these guys have quite a history behind them, and they've been fighting non-stop for all these years. Secondly, they know their country much better than the Americans will ever know their country, or NATO, or anyone else. They know the people, the geography, the terrain, and everything else about their country. Thirdly, a vital part, no guerrilla war has ever been lost if that guerrilla army has a sanctuary. A sanctuary to get rest, arms, weapons, more recruits. The Taliban have had a sanctuary in Pakistan. And without attacking that sanctuary, which the Americans did not do, without attacking that sanctuary, you have not been able to deal with the Taliban. Because there's constant renewal coming and there are sanctuaries probably in Iran and probably in Central Asia also, but the main sanctuary is in Pakistan. So I think that's and the third factor is that, two other factors I think. One is the constant use of intimidation and terror. A large part of the population which is under their control is there not because they love the Taliban, but because they're terrified of the Taliban and what the Taliban have done, to their civilians and their women and children and all the rest of it. And the fourth factor is that Taliban protect farmers who produce opium. In other words, the Taliban protect drugs production. If you're an Afghan farmer, you want to grow opium, you want to make some money for your family, which you can't make from wheat or making vegetables or something else, you will go to the Taliban and say, protect me, I'll give you so much percentage of my opium, here's my tax, you protect me. And that's what they do. So I can go on like this, there's a very long list of things that the Taliban do. Was that the second or the third?
And the third question was why Taliban would all of a sudden want to talk to elected president. It seems contradictory, at least in our understanding.
Look, what I said to you is that there is a peace lobby in the Taliban. Now, I can't predict to you, there are other views in the Taliban, of which there's, and for a time in 2010, the peace lobby dominated because they sanctioned the talks with the US, and that peace lobby was then, the talks broke up for different reasons, but for a period, that peace lobby was in control of the Taliban movement. Now, what is happening today, there's intense debate going on in the Taliban as to what they should do. And clearly, once the election is over and they see the direction the election takes, they will decide what to do. But we do have two essential, we have many different directions they could go in, but two essential directions. One is to restart talks with the new leader, who is not tainted by the American occupation or the American presence, who can at least stand up and say, well, look, I've just become president now, I had nothing to do with the Americans. The Americans have all left anyway. Or the second thing is that the young hardliners who are influenced by Al-Qaeda and by these other militant groups say, no, we're going to conquer Kabul. And we'll fight for as long as it takes, 20 years, but we're going to, and then of course the war will continue. But what direction they actually take is not something that I can predict to you. We have to see what happens in the elections.
Thank you.
Two questions which are related to regional cooperation. You said that among the three problems that there was no sufficient diplomatic work done to ensure regional cooperation, that the regional players will not subsequently interfere in Afghanistan. My question is why you think it was this way, why there was no diplomatic effort enough, and whether it is related maybe to feasibility of such regional framework, and so is it feasible or not? And the second is also about regional cooperation. You mentioned when fighting extremism that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could sort of succeed if it pushes the regional countries to cooperate with each other. And you didn't mention CSTO, for instance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Is this framework able to maybe push some of the players to cooperate?
Thank you. Gentlemen?
Yeah. First of all, I would say that I'm an Afghan citizen. I really don't agree with the scenario you portray for the future of Afghanistan, and because you are ignoring the ability of our national army. And you see, during this past election campaign, last few weeks, people they attended the election campaign in thousands, and there was not a single security incident, and they were able to protect the people. And also, why this ISI is supporting the Taliban? Well, what is their own specific interest in supporting the Taliban? And also, recently this attack on Kabul city hospital was believed to be plotted by ISI. And so, what we say in this regard?
Thank you. It's a different question.
Yeah, my question is about the economic power of Afghanistan.
Can you
as you said, the Afghan economy is not so good and was not really, it didn't recover during these 12 years. I agree with you, but you said that if election goes well and the new president is accepted by people first and by the international community, then it's still the economic problem will go and will continue, because maybe the foreign aids will decrease. But why you don't ever mention about the economic opportunities that Afghanistan could have? Like, one thing is the mining. You know that 2 big contracts were signed by China. It still is not. It was stopped, but I think it's because of this election that is very crucial, and we agree on that. The other thing is the negotiation with the Taliban from Afghan government side. I think, this is my belief, and many other people in the country believe that the whole agenda, negotiation with the Taliban, were brought up by Taliban lobbyists internationally and also inside Afghanistan. For example, one of them is Wahid Mujdah, who is is talking with the media always like a person who do not agree with the Taliban, but he was actually lobbying for a negotiation with the Taliban. Also, the other one is Michael Sample, the Irishman, who was actually deported from Afghanistan because of those things. And I think the same agenda goes with many other people, that they want to make this conclusion that fight against the Taliban will continue forever and it's not stoppable, Taliban are not defeatable. I think that's not the case because many things have changed in Afghanistan. First, briefly, I could say. First, people have the experience of the Taliban, they do not like that. People have the experience of civil war and they do not like that. And also, it's not just the people who are not Pashtuns, but the majority of Pashtuns who do not agree with the Taliban as well. So there is a kind of a national consensus that they don't want to be defeated by the Taliban or to share power with them. And I think, except some people in the government who are like, I think maybe misguided by this lobbying, international lobbying, the other people will still continue, and I think the reality goes against your argument. Thank you.
Okay, let me just take the last one first. Obviously, I did mention Afghanistan has got enormous mineral and oil and gas potential. I talked about that, in fact, I did mention it, but I also said at the same time, none of, mineral extraction cannot be done in times of war. We need a peace settlement. We need peace, we need stability. We need the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians to bring in billions of dollars worth of equipment to get the stuff out. And that cannot be done in the state of civil war. So unfortunately, Afghan's economic development will have to wait until we can first bring the war to an end. Secondly, the fact of the matter is, whatever you said that there may be lobbies who want talks with the Taliban and all that, and the fact of the matter is that for 2 years there was a dialogue between the Germans, the Americans, and the Taliban leadership. And that dialogue took place not because of individuals around here and there wanting the talks, because Mullah Muhammad Umar and President Obama ordered those talks. So you cannot deny history. Those talks did take place, and they're a precedent. That precedent we have to build on. That, if the Taliban could talk to the Americans, why can't they talk to the new president of Afghanistan? So this is not some conspiracy theory by a few individuals who, yes, certainly there are lobbies who want the Taliban to be coming to talks and all that, but after all, at the end of the day, it was the Taliban who started the talks. On CSTO, look, I'm one of those who's been thoroughly confused by what President Putin has said about Afghanistan. On the one hand, he says that the Americans should leave as quickly as possible. Get rid of the Americans. Get out. This is our area, my backyard. Nothing to do with you. Now, by saying that, you're giving the message to the Central Asians that actually Afghanistan is not a threat at all. Everything's fine in Afghanistan. The Americans should just leave and everything will be fine in Afghanistan. Then the second message is just the opposite. The second message is, no, it's a huge threat, drugs are coming, the fundamentalists are coming, you have to be, careful and all the rest of it. And that's a message to the Central Asians saying, there's a big threat, Central Asia, watch out. Now, naturally, the Central Asians are thoroughly confused. That Russia is giving us two conflicting signals about, is there a threat or isn't there a threat? And Russia, of course, Central Asia looks to Russia. Russia has the intelligence. Russia has all the organization and the knowledge and the experience and etc., etc. This part of the world, just like Europe looks to America, everyone here looks to Russia to give us a good judgment on is there a threat or isn't there a threat. So I think the very first thing we have to get from Russia and the CSTO is a real understanding and a real solid viewpoint as to is there a threat or isn't there? And if there is a threat, what is the threat? And how can that threat affect the former Soviet landmass and Central Asia? So I would like to see clarity in Russia's position on Central Asia. Before we really move forward, and I think really the time has come. There was a SCO meeting, Shanghai Cooperation meeting just now, a few weeks ago, here I think, and foreign summit or foreign, anyway, and the SCO has not made itself clear. The Shanghai has not made itself clear. What is the threat? The Central Asians are small states, young states. They don't have the security apparatus to deal with a major threat from, say, IMU or something like that. They need some wise judgment, wise solutions, and cooperation. But you're all playing politics with America. I mean, Russia, frankly, Russia, this is all about politics with the United States. You know, so I mean, if I was a Central Asian, I would be really upset. Because, you know, if Russia is trying to look after me, it's doing a bad job of looking after me. It's giving me totally contradictory opinions. What is the first one?
ISI's role.
Well, yeah, Pakistan has been very closely involved in Afghanistan. You know, since the Soviet period, it was the front line against the Soviets. It helped the CIA arm the Mujahideen, etc. So, I mean, you know, there's a whole cadre of extremist groups in Pakistan and military personnel who've been involved in Afghanistan all their lives. And even though I think now the mood has changed, I think now the military well understands that involvement in Afghanistan has only led to this terrible Taliban blowback. Actually changing people's opinion and giving them things to do which are not connected with Afghanistan. If you like, you know, this is a big ship, and trying to turn a big ship is very difficult and takes time. And I think, you know, I think we have to be patient. I hope Pakistan is going to be helpful and fruitful in with the new president coming in and with the possibility of peace talks starting. I hope Pakistan, the moment the new president comes in, if there is a good election, I hope Pakistan will do the utmost to help the peace process and to push the Taliban, which is, I think, has to be done. We have to push the Taliban out of Pakistan and into the arms of Kabul. And say to the Taliban, look, we're not handing you over to the Americans. We're not giving you to Guantanamo. We're not trying to kill you, but we want you to enter into peace talks with the Afghan government. And here, by the way, is a time frame. We're only giving you now 1 year. We can't keep you now forever. So I think Pakistan can really do some very assertive things. And I think this government will do things once the Afghan elections are over. I certainly hope so. Because certainly it's been a very, you know, somebody who has loved Afghanistan for all these years and has worked in Afghanistan and for Afghanistan for all these years. It is very painful for me personally to see my own country not being a help to Afghanistan rather than being a hindrance. And I can only hope that now we might be moving towards some kind of help to Afghanistan.
Thank you. And I also have two final questions as time is going on. Gentlemen here and lady there.
What is the #1 political mistake the U.S. has made in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
There are two different sets of policies that need to be applied, you know, one to one and the other to the other. You can't talk about the Taliban as some generic factor. The IMU also call themselves Taliban sometimes, but, you know, I would not lump them with these Taliban. I would, you know, talk about the IMU separately. So where I think the priority for Pakistan is that, you know, we have to deal with our own Taliban because they are the most immediate threat to the state. The Afghan Taliban, thank God, are not fighting the Pakistan state. The Pakistani Taliban are fighting the state, and we have to deal with them. I don't think talks at this stage, frankly, are going to be effective at all. Because the Taliban are nothing as unified as, you know, the Afghan Taliban are. So we have to deal with the Pakistani Taliban in a more militarized, more aggressive manner. And we have to deal with the Afghan Taliban in a more diplomatic and more pressure manner. John, your question would be very hard to answer. I could, you know, probably give you a very long list indeed. But I think, you know, if you look, I mean, historically, I think the walking away from Afghanistan in '89 and '90 by the U.S. I think the diplomatic solution at that time was well within your grasp. The Soviets wanted it. Shevardnadze, who I met with at that time, wanted it very dearly and went to Washington to try and get it. And Gorbachev wanted it. And unfortunately, at that time, I think the CIA didn't want it because they wanted a revenge on Vietnam. and consequently the US blew that option. And if that had happened, I think we could have all saved ourselves a lot of trouble. I think in this period, in the last 10 years, I would say the abrogation of US diplomacy, which has mattered so much in the lives of perhaps our generation. Really effective mediation, diplomacy, problem resolution. But instead what we've seen in the last 10 years is an increasing reliance on military force as the answer to everything. And as a result, what has happened, sadly, in the US itself, in Washington, in the international organizations like the UN, real diplomatic stars don't emerge anymore. Diplomacy is not seen as some kind of big, an award-winning, you don't get the good guys and the big guys doing diplomacy. You get them all doing military stuff. So that is the real tragedy at the moment. We don't have world-class diplomats anywhere in the world. Nowhere. Not the United States, not the United Nations, not Russia, not anywhere. Diplomats are out there to solve problems, not to militarize problems. And unfortunately, we are living in an era in which governments are constantly using military means to look at problems and calling in their generals to look at problems rather than calling in their diplomats to look at problems and say, how can we solve this? And just before I go, I'm sorry, I was supposed to bring a set of books, but anyway, there's one book of mine here, which is called Jihad, the Rise of Militant Islam in Central Asia, which is quite old. It was written in 2002, but it's the history of Hizb ut-Tahrir and Islamic IMU and others. This is for your library. And thank you very much for doing it.
Very briefly, I guess the whole classroom, the room would join us in saying that it was a very great privilege for us to have you speak today with this audience and offer this very enthusiastic and interesting call and address these some very nice and good challenging questions. Thank you everyone for coming and spending this afternoon with us. Have a nice weekend and see you in our next event.